Just over 2 years ago now, GE announced plans to divide its business into 3 publicly traded companies focused on healthcare, energy, and aviation. GE Healthcare was spun off just over a year ago, and early next month, the last piece will fall into place when GE separates into GE Aerospace and GE Vernova, encompassing its energy business. We sat with the GE CEO who has overseen the restructuring from the start, Larry Culp, and the man who will be CEO of GE Vernova, Scott Strazik.
If you go back 5 years, we really were, I think, tasked with 2 simple objectives. One was a significant deleveraging of our balance sheet. Secondly, we needed to execute an operational turnaround across the business, but it was particularly acute in our power segment, particularly the gas power business that Scott ran at the time. So you fast forward, we reduced our debt load by over $100 billion. Scott and the team really executed, I think, a phenomenal turn in gas power and then with the rest of our power segment. And we were sitting there as the pandemic was beginning to lift. We could see the merger of our aircraft leasing business with one of our key competitors, AerCap, coming to a quick close. And we really had to decide what's the go-forward structure for GE. And given we had had so much success with the decentralization, given that the capital markets clearly liked the businesses but didn't like them together, it was actually an easy decision, one we took a little over 2 years ago, to say, it'll take us a couple of years to pull this off, but when the dust settles, GE Healthcare, GE Vernova, and GE Aerospace will all be on their own bottoms.
You may have just answered that in your answer, which is why'd you pick Scott? No, not to speak about your presence, Scott, but how'd you pick Scott? Is it because of the role he had in the turnaround?
Most definitely. I met Scott back August of 18. Yes. I wasn't even in this chair yet. It was the first GE business that I had visited down in Atlanta. And I came away thinking, this is a really strong team, but there's some things that we're doing that probably are working against us. So we began the pivot to focus more on the businesses as opposed to the segment. Scott was running gas power services at the time. We asked him to step up into a big job to run all of gas power. We knew that was job one with respect to the overall operational turnaround at GE, and he and the team, I think, executed near flawlessly through that, and then he picked up additional responsibility with the rest of the power segment, and then in turn, the renewables businesses. And at each step of the way, Scott stepped up, delivered, built teams that did the same. So when it came time to think about the next CEO for this business as a public entity, Scott was an easy choice.
So Scott, now you've got the big job. I suspect even if it was flawless, to use Larry's term, it was not all that easy to do that turnaround. What in your experience in GE and specifically in that turnaround really do you think prepares you for this big new role?
Well, I mean, GE has always been a great laboratory to learn and experiment, and we've always had great people. But I think over the last 5 to 5.5 years, really the lean operating system that we've been implementing, and really started with gas, right? In 19, where we were on a monthly cadence with Larry and really focusing a team that always had great ambition. But did we really have an ability to focus on the critical few customer KPIs every day, while also protecting for the long-term breakthroughs? And the ability to multitask those things, our teams weren't always great with. And that's really a lot of what we were focused on in 19 into 20 together, is to build that rhythm that we could prioritize what mattered most to get the short term right, but not at the expense of also investing for the long term. And that's a lot of what we worked on in gas power together in 19. And that was really foundational for gas power, and it's really what we've been extrapolating across the rest of Vernova.
So as you take over this new role, tell me what the opportunities you see, and break it down, if you would, between 2 categories. One is the one you just talked about operationally, your lean approach and what that does. Really more opportunities to really drive that further, and how much of it's just a rising tide with energy transition.
We are excited about the markets and where they're going, and there are a lot of examples of that today. You know, data centers in the U.S., it represented 2% of the load growth in 2020. Many people think it could be 8% by 2030.
At the center of Vernova's strategy is growing its energy business in the midst of a massive transition to more sustainable energy around the world. Its Chief Sustainability Officer, Roger Martella, gives us an example of how Vernova will set its priorities in building out the electrical grid in a way that is both good business and good for the climate.
We know we're going to deploy the technology and run businesses to develop technology to electrify the grid. But from a sustainability perspective, we want to do more than just put capacity on the grid. We want to focus on where are we putting that capacity? How are we helping countries that are struggling to provide affordable, reliable, sustainable electricity? Can we double click on those countries and make sure we're not just going where the phone's ringing, but how can we affirmatively reach out to places in the world to enhance sustainability when it comes to electrification?
Sustainability really is at the heart of everything we're doing. And for us, we define sustainability as the complement of both together, keeping the lights on while decreasing the carbon intensity of the install base every day. And it'd be wonderful if we could wave a magic wand and have no carbon. But the reality is that's not the world we live in. So how do we sustainably electrify the world while making it cleaner every day? They really go together. And to do that, it really does require a complement of technologies. And that's where Vernova is somewhat unique, because we've got the power generation technologies with things like gas, nuclear, wind, but we also play across the grid at both moving electrons, orchestrating the grid, and the system's becoming more complicated. And our ability to serve our customers with all of those solutions gives us a unique vantage point.
So Larry, as somebody who's about to turn over the keys, if I can put it that way, to power, how do you assess their opportunities going forward? I mean, what are the really growth opportunities for Vernova?
Well, I think you just hit on it, David, in the question, and Scott talking about all the different dimensions of the energy transition. We have excellent exposure, leadership positions, really in almost all the ones that matter. So I don't really worry about the top line environment in this business, and that we couldn't have said that 4 or 5 years ago. But the world over, I think we really are set in that regard. So we need to make sure we execute.
How does wind fit into what you're doing? Because that's been more of a struggle, not just for GE, but for others as well, as opposed to gas power. How do you see wind playing out?
You bet. It has been an industry-wide challenge. But if you take a step back and think about the world today gets about 7% of its power from electricity from wind, most projections believe by 2040 that needs to be closer to 25%. So wind matters. But the reality is we need to industrialize at scale the wind products to a level that it can actually reach those levels. And that's really what we're focused on right now, is building workhorse products that we can do at scale. We're seeing real progress with that. We've turned our onshore wind business back to profitability the second half of last year with momentum to follow. We're working on doing much of the same with our offshore wind business today.
The government plays a large role in Vernova's future, as it has seen the public-private partnership strengthen over the last 18 to 24 months.
I do think in the electric power system, public-private partnerships are always going to matter. We've built this grid and this system over 100 years on the foundation of public-private partnerships. But there's a lot of other drivers beyond that today. The reality is industries are electrifying, and they're going to electrify either way. We think about EVs, we think about home heating and heat pumps. That's going to happen. And that demand cycle exists regardless, but there's also always going to be a role for that public-private partnership.
Jennifer Granholm, the Secretary of Energy, likes to say the energy transition should be private sector led, enabled by the public sector. And that's just been this fundamental realignment between the public sectors and the private sectors that's given us great tailwinds to go ahead and partner with the government to accelerate innovation and technology.
We continue the conversation with Larry Culp and Scott Strazik, taking up Larry's role as CEO of GE Aerospace and the common heritage it will continue to share with GE Vernova after the spinoff.
We have a tremendous visibility, both with respect to our service business, which represents about 70% of our revenue, simply because the airlines are back well above 2019 activity levels, and they need us to support the engines that propel all of that traffic. And at the same time, they're looking to expand and modernize their fleets, both in single aisle and wide body configurations. So in order for a new plane today, a new engine probably isn't fulfilled until 2030. So we have tremendous demand potential, both in services and in new units. We need to make sure we're delivering profitably over the next several years.
I'm not sure how many people understand. I'm not sure I understood the extent of your defense contracting. I mean, a substantial portion, not a majority, but a substantial portion is defense. How does that figure into your future plans?
Well, our defense business, we talked about that this week with investors. We're going to call that segment Defense and Propulsion Technologies. That's a $9 billion business, primarily in defense, large position here in the U.S., particularly with rotorcraft, think helicopters, the Apaches and the Blackhawks, in addition to combat fighter aircraft. And as those assets are being used with more frequency, we contribute to the readiness of those assets, and in turn, as our warfighters need more capability, be it in a rotorcraft or in a combat jet, that's where the next generation of GE Aerospace technology has a role to play.
As we look around the world right now, one of the things we hear repeatedly is the geopolitical risk has gone up substantially. We've got a ground war in Europe, we've got conflict in the Middle East, we've got issues with the South China Sea, we're not sure what's going on with Iran. As you look out, does that suggest to you that there's going to be a continuing rising tide on your defense contracting?
We believe so, David. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of political dysfunction relative to the budget currently in Washington. But what we shared with investors was very much that same geopolitical backdrop. Unfortunately, that may not get better before it gets more tense. And again, both here in the U.S. and around the world, our business supports the warfighter, in both configurations. And we know that there are advanced technologies that governments want to deploy or be ready to deploy over time. And that's where we're investing from an R&D perspective.
So, Laura, you and I have talked about it before. Every CEO, Scott and you, maybe your most important, most immediate task is allocating capital. Figuring out, do you keep it, do you invest it, do you return it back to shareholders? You made an announcement this week about returning to shareholders some capital. Give us a sense of why you made that decision.
Well, David, a lot of investors have been anticipating a significant excess capital position at GE Aerospace. And I love saying that because, again, it wasn't that long ago we were looking at a mountain of debt that we needed to knock down, and we did. But what we shared with investors was we think over the next 3 years, we probably have $34 to $36 billion of capital to allocate. We'll first tend to what we need to tend to from an operating perspective, organic investments, be it R&D, CapEx, or second order. But we're still going to have a tremendous amount of capital to deploy. And what we've said is we see 70 to 75% of that going back to shareholders by way of buybacks and dividends. The board just last week authorized a $15 billion stock buyback. That will leave 20 to 25% of our available free cash to reinvest inorganically. And I don't think we'll do a lot of big M&A to start, but you'll see us continue to do smaller bolt-ons that I think fortify our existing competitive positions.
I think a lot of people would hear that and say, well, that's really good news for the shareholders because they get more cash in their pocket that they can do with what they want. At the same time, it also indicates you don't see a lot of great investment opportunities out there for that capital, because if you did, you'd keep the capital and invest it.
Well, I think that we have reserved the right to explore those inorganic opportunities. But in many respects, David, the best investment that we can make is in GE Aerospace. And that's what you see with that capital allocation framework.
What about your capital allocation? What are you looking at, Scott?
A lot of organic growth opportunities. Again, when we think about the grid and the substantial modernization needed of the grid, we're going to invest substantially in capacity additions to do that. There is still new technology that needs to be advanced on things like direct air capture, things like small modular reactors and the grid software that's critical to the future. That's really our near-term priority, is really investing organically and positioning this business to grow. And as we do that, first things first, we'll then evaluate some of these other things over time.
You cannot talk about the future of the aviation business without talking about the future of aviation itself. And GE Aerospace VP of Engineering, Muhammad Ali, has some bold thoughts about what that future may hold.
Our purpose statement is we invent the future flight, lift people up, and bring them home safely. And we believe it starts with bringing people home safely, and that earns us the right to lift people up, which in turn earns us the right to invent the future of flight. I think RISE has this beautiful open fan technology. It has, which attracts all the attention and obviously a lot of the questions, but right behind that, hybrid electric capable, state-of-the-art high pressure temperature capability, high pressure turbine capability that we are designing using state-of-the-art supercomputing. We are also at significant advances in materials that we are putting in there, and sustainable aviation fuel capable from day one.
This is a business that has really been built developing generational improvements in sustainability in jet engines over time. But we've often not referred to it as sustainability. We've really referred to it as efficiency. But every time a next generation aircraft comes forward, it's really the result of a next generation engine technology coming to market.
Scott, same question to you when it comes to power.
You bet.
Technological development. What are you looking at? What is out on the horizon for GE Vernova?
There's a lot of exciting things. Direct air capture. How do we manage carbon? We've got a prototype right now that's pulling carbon out of the air as we speak. Small modular reactor, 300 megawatt blocks of power that we'll commission this decade that we think can transform the nuclear industry. Robotics and inspection technology with our wind business that ensures that every blade that leaves our factory has been fully inspected to get quality right the first time. Grid software, our Grid OS, grid orchestration system, as we say it, to really help our customers deal with the complexities in the grid today as more folks put solar panels on their homes and charge EVs at night, and there's more bi-directional flows of electricity. All opportunities, so a long list.
Even as aerospace and energy separated GE, there is a deeply shared DNA going all the way back to Thomas Edison, a shared DNA none of the sister companies wants to give up.
We absolutely have shared heritage. And actually that shared heritage goes all the way back to Thomas Edison, who founded General Electric Company. And that shared heritage, there is a statement that's written at the entrance to many of our facilities, including our aerospace research facility, that says, that quote from Thomas Edison, that said, "I find what the world needs, and I go about inventing it." And that's exactly what we will be doing in GE Aerospace, and I am confident that that's what the GE Vernova team is going to be doing as well.
One thing I'd say about working at GE Vernova, you come to work every day and you feel like you're in awe of history. We have 80,000 employees with these incredibly diverse backgrounds all around the world doing so many different things. This is the one thing we have in common. We're motivated by this purpose-built company of electrification and decarbonization. So that's what inspires us every day.
When I reflect on the last 5.5 years, it really has been about the team, David. Scott talked about what we take forward. We take a lot of technology forward, but this is an immensely talented, resilient, ambitious team that I couldn't be more proud of. Go back to 2018, there were a lot of people who wanted to give up on our company. We didn't. And there were a lot of folks that came into our boardroom and into the management ranks who understood just how good these businesses can be, how strong this team is day in, day out. We just needed a little bit of time to work through some of those issues. Scott and I know our companies go back to Edison. Right, a lot of us over time have studied the GE management playbook. Scott grew up in that environment. I grew up looking in from the outside. So we're proud of that history and everything that so many people have contributed to our company over time. We're the stewards of the business at this point in time. And even though we go forward as three, we'll share that brand, we'll share that DNA. And I'm sure Edison and everybody else looking down will be proud of what they see from these three businesses on an independent basis going forward.
Many thanks to Larry Culp of GE Aerospace and Scott Strazik of GE Vernova.